There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself with tears or tantrums. It sits quietly in the corner of a room, watching, waiting, hoping to be noticed without ever asking to be seen. This is the loneliness of the ignored child, a child whose presence was never quite enough to demand attention, whose voice was drowned out not by cruelty, but by indifference. Indifference, after all, is not the opposite of love. It's the absence of it. And for a child, that absence becomes a silent teacher whispering lessons about worth, about belonging, about what it means to exist in a world that doesn't seem to register your existence. The ignored child grows up, but the feeling of invisibility, that stays. It lingers in the way they speak, the way they love, the way they move through the world as if apologizing for taking up space. There are children who cry out and are not heard. And then there are children who learn, very early, not to cry out at all. The ignored child is not the one with the broken arm or the failing grades. They are not the child who acts out, who slams doors, who demands to be noticed. They are the one who sits at the dinner table and speaks into the space between conversations, only to realize no one was listening. They are the one who waits by the window, hoping someone will ask about their day, and then quietly walks away when no one does. This is not a story of violence or rage. It is a story of absence, of emotional white noise, of a childhood spent wondering if you were ever really there at all. The ignored child learns to read the room before entering it. They learn to measure their words carefully, to shrink their needs into something manageable, something that won't inconvenience anyone. They become experts at gauging whether this is a good time to speak, whether their presence is wanted, whether their feelings are worth the trouble, and more often than not, they decide they are not. What does it feel like to grow up this way? It feels like floating, like existing in a space where you are neither fully present nor entirely absent. You are there, physically at the table, in the room, in the family photo, but emotionally, you are somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere safer. Because to be fully present, to show up with all your needs and feelings intact, is to risk being overlooked again. And that risk, over time, becomes unbearable. So they adapt. They become easy children, the one who doesn't need much, the one who can entertain themselves, who doesn't ask for help, who learns to solve their own problems before anyone even notices there was a problem to begin with. They smile when they're supposed to smile. They nod when they're supposed to nod. They learn that being low maintenance is a form of survival. But beneath that surface, something else is happening. A belief is forming. Not a loud belief, not a conscious one, but a quiet, persistent whisper that says, you are not important enough to be seen. Your feelings are not urgent enough to matter. Your presence is not significant enough to be noticed. And because this belief is never spoken aloud, because it is absorbed through 1,000 small moments of being talked over, walked past, forgotten, it becomes truth. Not the kind of truth that can be argued with or disproven. The kind of truth that lives in the body, in the way they hold themselves. In this way they apologize for things that aren't their fault. On the way they enter a room as if asking permission to exist. The ignored child grows up believing that love is something you earn by being unobtrusive. That connection is something you receive only if you don't ask for too much of it. That being seen is a privilege reserved for those who are louder, brighter, more demanding than you could ever be. And so they learn to live in the margins, to watch from the sidelines, to exist quietly, carefully, as if their very presence is an imposition. But here's the thing about being ignored. It doesn't just hurt in the moment. It shapes everything that comes after. It shapes the way they love, always holding back, always wondering if they're too much or not enough. It shapes the way they speak, apologizing before they've even finished their sentence. It shapes the way they see themselves not as someone worthy of attention, but as someone lucky to be tolerated. The silence that shaped them was never loud. It was never violent, but it was constant. And in that constant, it became the most powerful teacher they ever had. It taught them that their emotions were inconvenient, that their needs were burdensome, that their existence was something to be managed, not celebrated. And now, years later, they carry that lesson everywhere, in every relationship, in every conversation, in every moment where they hesitate to speak, to ask, to show up fully because some part of them still believes that no one is really listening anyway. This is the inheritance of the ignored child. Not trauma in the traditional sense, not a single shattering moment, but a slow, quiet erosion of the belief that they matter. that they are worth noticing, that their presence in the world is anything more than background noise. And the cruelest part? They learn to ignore themselves too. Ignoring a child is rarely intentional. It doesn't announce itself as neglect. It doesn't arrive with malice or cruelty. It happens in the ordinary moments, in the gaps between attention, in the rhythm of a household where some voices naturally rise above others. It begins with a parent who is tired, not cruel, just tired. A parent stretched thin by work, by bills, by the weight of keeping everything together. A parent who looks at the quiet child sitting in the corner with a book and thinks, at least that one is okay. At least that one doesn't need me right now. And they're not wrong. The child is okay. Or at least they seem okay. They're not crying, they're not breaking things. They're not demanding attention in ways that feel urgent. So the parent moves on, to the sibling who is louder, to the problem that feels more pressing, to the crisis that cannot wait. And the quiet child? They learn to wait. They learn that their needs are not emergencies, that their feelings can be postponed. That love is not something you receive simply by existing, it is something you earn by not being a problem. Sometimes it begins with a sibling, the one who was born first, or born sick, or born with a personality that fills every room they enter. The one who, without meaning to, becomes the sun around which the family orbits. And the ignored child? They become the moon. Present, but only visible when the light is just right. Always there, but rarely the focus. It's not the sibling's fault. It's not even the parent's fault. It's simply the mathematics of attention in a household where there is never quite enough to go around. Someone will always get more. Someone will always get less. And the ignored child learns, quietly and without protest, that they are the one who gets less. Sometimes it begins even earlier. In infancy. In the crib. A baby who doesn't cry as much. A baby who sleeps through the night. A baby who, by sheer temperament, seems to need less. And the exhausted parent, grateful for the reprieve, doesn't realize that the baby's quietness is not contentment, it's adaptation. It's the beginning of a pattern that will follow them for the rest of their life. Because here's the truth about emotional attunement. It requires presence. It requires someone to notice not just the loud signals, the tantrums, the tears, the obvious distress, but the quiet ones. The child who withdraws. The child who stops asking. The child who learns to self-soothe, not because they feel safe, but because they've realized no one is coming. The ignored child is not ignored because they are unloved. They are ignored because they are easy to overlook. Because in a world that rewards noise, they are quiet. Because in a household that responds to urgency, their needs never feel urgent enough. And so the moments accumulate. The times they tried to show their parents a drawing, only to be met with a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before the parent turned away. The times they waited for someone to ask about their day, only to watch the conversation move on without them. The times they felt something big, something overwhelming, and looked around for someone to help them hold it, only to realize everyone else was busy holding something else. None of these moments are devastating on their own, but together they form a narrative. A story the child begins to tell themselves about who they are and what they're worth. I am the one who doesn't need attention. I am the one who can handle things on my own. I am the one whose feelings are not important enough to interrupt anyone else's life. And the cruelest part? The child internalizes this. They begin to take pride in it, in being low maintenance, in being independent. I don't need anyone. Because if you can't be loved for who you are, you can at least be valued for what you don't ask for. The parents don't see it happening. How could they? The child is fine. They're doing well in school. They're not causing problems. They're not acting out. From the outside, everything looks okay. But on the inside, a child is learning that their emotions are an inconvenience, that their presence is only acceptable when it's unobtrusive. That connection is something that happens to other people. The louder ones, the needier ones, the ones who don't know how to be quiet. Sometimes, the ignoring is even more subtle. It's not that the parent isn't there, it's that they're there, but not really present. They're on the phone. They're thinking about work. They're emotionally somewhere else. And the child learns to sense this. They learn to recognize the glazed look in a parent's eyes. The half-hearted, uh-huh. That means their words are being heard but not listened to. And so they stop trying. Not all at once, but gradually. They stop bringing their parents things to look at. They stop asking questions they know won't really be answered. They stop reaching out, because reaching out has taught them that their hand will be met with empty air. This is where it begins. Not in a single moment of rejection, but in 1,000 small moments of being unseen, of being present, but not noticed, of existing in a space where everyone else's needs, everyone else's voices, everyone else's emotions take up all the room. And the child? The child learns to take up less space, to need less, to exist quietly in the margins of their own life. Because if they can't be seen, at least they can be easy to live with. At least they can be the one who doesn't cause problems. At least they can be the one everyone can count on to be okay, even when they're not. There is a term in developmental psychology, emotional attunement. It describes the process by which a caregiver mirrors, recognizes, and responds to a child's emotional state. It is the foundation of secure attachment, the bedrock of a healthy sense of self. When a baby cries and someone comes not just to fix the problem, but to acknowledge the feeling, the baby learns something profound. They learn that their internal world matters, that their emotions are real, valid, and worthy of response, that they exist, not just physically, but emotionally. But when a child's emotions are consistently met with indifference, with distraction, with the subtle message that what they feel is not urgent enough to warrant attention, something else is learned, something key-to, something that will shape the architecture of their mind for decades to come. The ignored child does not develop secure attachment. They develop what psychologists call avoidant attachment. They learn that emotional needs are burdensome, that vulnerability is risky, that the safest way to move through the world is to need as little as possible from others. They learn to self-regulate, not because they feel secure, but because they've realized that no one else is going to regulate for them. And this happens not just psychologically, but neurologically. The brain of a child is constantly scanning for patterns, for cues about how the world works and where they fit in it. When a child receives consistent emotional responsiveness, their brain develops neural pathways for connection, for trust, for the belief that others are safe to depend on. But when a child is repeatedly ignored, their brain learns a different lesson. It learns that others are unreliable, that emotional expression is futile, that the safest strategy is to suppress needs, to minimize feelings, to become emotionally self-sufficient. This is not a conscious choice. It is an adaptation, a survival mechanism. The brain is simply doing what brains do, learning from experience and adjusting behavior accordingly. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, develops differently in children who grow up with inconsistent or absent emotional attunement. They become hyper-independent, hyper-vigilant. They learn to read the emotional climate of a room before entering it, to gauge whether their presence is welcome, whether their feelings will be met with patience or impatience. They become, in essence, experts at managing themselves so that no one else has to. But here's what the research shows. This kind of self-sufficiency comes at a cost. Children who grow up emotionally ignored often struggle with something called alexithymia difficulty, identifying and expressing their own emotions. Because if no one ever reflected your feelings back to you, if no one ever helped you name what you were experiencing, how would you learn to recognize it yourself? They feel something, but they can't quite articulate what it is. Sadness, anger, loneliness, it all blurs together into a vague discomfort, a sense that something is wrong but they can't pinpoint what. And because they can't name it, they can't process it, so it stays, it lingers, it accumulates. Psychologist John Bowlby, who pioneered attachment theory, described this phenomenon as compulsive self-reliance. The child learns to rely exclusively on themselves, not because they are naturally independent, but because depending on others has proven too painful, too unreliable. And this pattern doesn't end in childhood. It follows them into adulthood, into their relationships, into the way they love. They become the partner who never asks for help, the friend who always listens but never shares, the person who is always there for others but never lets others be there for them. Because somewhere deep in their nervous system, there is still that child who learned that needing people is dangerous, that showing vulnerability is a risk they cannot afford to take. Neuroscience tells us that the brain is shaped by experience, that the patterns we learn in childhood become the default settings for how we navigate the world. The ignored child's brain learned to expect invisibility, And so even when they are in rooms full of people who care about them, who want to see them, their brain still operates from that old programming. It still scans for signs of disinterest. It still prepares for the moment when they will, once again, be overlooked. This is called a negativity bias, the brain's tendency to focus on and remember negative experiences more than positive ones. For the ignored child, this bias is amplified. One moment of being talked over can erase 10 moments of being heard. One instance of distraction can confirm what they've always believed, that they are not important enough to hold someone's full attention. And so they withdraw. Not dramatically, not visibly, but internally. They stop offering pieces of themselves. They stop reaching out. They convince themselves that they prefer solitude, that they don't need connection, that they are fine on their own. But beneath that conviction, there is a longing, a deep, aching longing to be seen, to be known, to matter to someone without having to earn it, to exist in someone's awareness, not as an afterthought, but as a priority. The tragedy of the ignored child is not that they were hurt in obvious ways. It's that they were hurt in invisible ways. Ways that don't show up on any diagnostic checklist. Ways that don't fit neatly into categories of trauma or abuse. But the impact is real. It lives in their body. In this way, their shoulders tense when they speak. In this way, they apologize for things that aren't their fault. In this way, they monitor conversations, always ready to step back, always prepared to be interrupted, always expecting to be the one whose words matter least. This is what it means to grow up ignored. It means learning, at a neurological level, that you are not the protagonist of your own story, that you are the background character, the extra, the one who exists to support others, but never to be supported. And the brain, ever adaptive, ever efficient, learns to accept this. It stops fighting for attention. It stops demanding to be seen. It learns, instead, to disappear. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from wanting two opposite things at the same time. The ignored child grows up and carries this exhaustion with them. On one side, there is a deep, almost primal longing to be seen, to be noticed, to matter to someone in a way that feels effortless, unconditional, undeniable. On the other side, there is an equally powerful fear, a terror, even of being a burden, of asking for too much, of needing in ways that might push people away. And so they exist in the space between these two forces. Wanting connection but afraid to reach for it, craving visibility but trained to remain hidden, longing to be known but convinced that being truly known would reveal something unworthy, something that would justify the years of being overlooked. This is the inner war, and it is exhausting. They enter relationships, friendships, romances, even professional connections with a strange kind of hesitation. They are drawn to people who seem warm, attentive, and emotionally available. People who offer the kind of presence they never received as a child. But as soon as they get close, something shifts. The old programming kicks in. Am I talking too much? Am I being too needy? Am I taking up too much space? They monitor themselves constantly. They measure their words, their requests, their emotions against some invisible scale that determines whether they're still within acceptable limits, whether they're still easy to love, whether they're still the kind of person who doesn't require too much effort. And the moment they sense that they might be crossing that line, that they might be becoming the kind of person who needs things, who has expectations, who takes up room, they pull back, they apologize, they minimize, they retreat into the familiar safety of not needing anyone. But the longing doesn't go away, it just gets buried deeper. They watch other people ask for help without shame. They watch others express needs freely, confidently, as if it's the most natural thing in the world. And they feel something complex. Part admiration, part envy, part disbelief that anyone could be so comfortable with their own vulnerability. Because for the ignored child, vulnerability has never felt safe. It has always felt like exposure, like handing someone a weapon and hoping they won't use it. So they develop strategies, ways of getting their needs met without actually having to ask. They become hyper-aware of what others need, hoping that if they give enough, care enough, support enough, perhaps someone will notice what they need in return. Perhaps someone will see through the performance of being fine and recognize the quiet plea underneath. Please, see me, without me having to beg for it. But this strategy rarely works, because people take them at face value. If you say you're fine, they believe you. If you never ask for help, they assume you don't need it. And so the cycle continues. The ignored child gives and gives, hoping someone will read between the lines, hoping someone will offer what they're too afraid to ask for. And when no one does, they tell themselves it confirms what they've always known, that their needs are not important enough, that they were right to keep quiet, that asking would have been a mistake. The inner war intensifies. Some of them want to scream, to finally, after all these years, say what they've never been able to say. I need you. I need to matter to you. I need to know that my presence in your life is not just tolerated but wanted. But another part of them, the louder part, the part that learned the rules early, says, don't risk it. Don't be the needy one. Don't be the problem. Stay quiet, stay easy, stay safe. And so they stay silent. They swallow the words. They convince themselves that they're better off not needing anyone anyway. That independence is strength. That solitude is freedom. But it's not. It's loneliness dressed up as a choice. The war plays out in small moments. In the text message they draft and delete a dozen times before finally not sending it at all. In the conversation where they start to share something real, something vulnerable, and then laugh it off halfway through because they notice the other person glancing at their phone. In relationships where they are always the listener, the supporter, the steady one, because being anything else feels too risky, too revealing, too much. They become experts at reading micro-expressions, at detecting the slightest shift in tone, the smallest hint of impatience or distraction. And when they sense it, when they feel that familiar cue that their presence is no longer fully wanted, they withdraw, quietly, gracefully, as if they were never really there to begin with. This is what it means to live in the inner war, to want desperately to be seen while simultaneously doing everything possible to remain invisible, to crave connection while believing, at the deepest level, that true connection is not something they deserve. And the cruelest part? They don't even realize they're doing it. They think this is just who they are, the independent one, the low-maintenance one, the one who doesn't need much. They don't recognize it as a defense mechanism, as a learned behavior, as the residue of a childhood spent learning that their needs were inconvenient and their presence was optional. They think everyone feels this way, that everyone carries this constant internal negotiation between wanting and hiding, that everyone monitors themselves this carefully, this relentlessly, to make sure they're not asking for too much. But not everyone does. Some people learned early that their needs were valid, that their emotions were welcome, that their presence was a gift, not an imposition. The ignored child learned the opposite. And now, even when they are surrounded by people who would gladly see them, who want to know them, who are waiting for them to let their guard down, they can't. Because the war inside them is louder than any reassurance from the outside. You matter, someone says. And they hear, you matter, as long as you don't need too much, as long as you stay easy, as long as you don't become a burden. The war continues. The longing pulls them forward. The fear pulls them back. And they remain where they have always been, in between, visible enough to be present, invisible enough to stay safe. I want everything, asking for nothing, waiting for someone to see them, without ever giving anyone the chance to do so. There comes a moment, sometimes sudden, sometimes slow, when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It might happen in a conversation with a friend who says, gently, you know you can ask me for things, right? And something in the way they say it makes the ignored child pause, because they realize they've never actually believed that. Not really. Or it might happen in a relationship that finally feels safe, where someone notices their silence and instead of moving on, stops, waits, asks, what are you not saying? And for the first time in their life, they don't have an easy answer, because they've spent so long not saying things that they've forgotten how to access what's actually inside them. Sometimes it happens alone. Late at night, in the kind of silence that makes thoughts louder. They replay a moment from earlier that day, a moment where they needed something and didn't ask. A moment where they felt hurt and said nothing. A moment where they watched themselves disappear, again, and suddenly the exhaustion of it all becomes unbearable. And they think, how long have I been doing this? The recognition doesn't arrive with fanfare. It's not a dramatic revelation. It's quieter than that, more unsettling. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize how much of your life has been spent making yourself small, invisible, undemanding, you can't go back to pretending it's just who you are. You realize it's what you learned to be. And that realization cracks something open. They begin to notice the ways they've been living in the margins of their own life, how they've been waiting for permission to exist fully, how they've been rationing their needs, their feelings, their presence, as if there's only so much of themselves they're allowed to offer before it becomes too much. They start to see it everywhere. In this way, they apologize before speaking. In this way, they minimize their accomplishments, their pain, their desires. In the way, they've convinced themselves that not needing anyone is the same as being strong. But it's not strength, it's self-protection. It's the armor they built as a child when they realized no one was coming to help them carry what they were feeling. And suddenly, the cost of that armor becomes visible. They see how it's kept people at a distance, how it's made intimacy feel impossible, how it's turned every relationship into a performance where they play the role of the person who's always fine, always okay, always easy, while the real them, the one who needs and wants and hurts, stays hidden. They realize they've been living as if their presence in other people's lives is conditional, as if they're only allowed to stay as long as they don't ask for too much, don't feel too much, don't need too much. But where did that rule come from? Who decided that love was something you had to earn by being low maintenance? Who taught them that being seen was a privilege reserved for people who demanded it, rather than a basic human need? The answer, of course, is no one. And everyone. It wasn't a single person who taught them this. It was the accumulation of 1,000 moments where their needs went unmet, their feelings went unnoticed, their presence went unacknowledged. And now, here they are. An adult who still carries that child inside them. The one who learned to stay quiet, to stay small, to stay out of the way. But something is shifting, because awareness, once it arrives, has a way of demanding change. You can't know what you know now. You can't unsee the pattern. You can't go back to sleepwalking through relationships, pretending that you're fine with being invisible. They begin to ask themselves difficult questions. What would it feel like to actually ask for what I need? What would happen if I stopped monitoring myself so carefully? What if I let someone see me, really see me without apologizing for it? The questions are terrifying, because they've spent their entire life believing that the answer to what would happen is they would leave. They would realize I'm too much. They would confirm what I've always feared, that I'm not worth the effort. But something else is happening too, a quiet rebellion, a small voice that says, what if that's not true? What if I've been wrong this whole time? This is the turning point. Not a sudden transformation, not a miraculous healing, but a shift in awareness. A willingness to consider that maybe, just maybe, the story they've been telling themselves about their own worth is based on old information. In a childhood where they were overlooked, but not because they were unworthy, simply because the people around them were distracted, overwhelmed, or unable to see what they needed. And that's not the same thing as being unlovable. They start to experiment, cautiously, tentatively. They try asking for something small. They try expressing a need without immediately apologizing for it. They try staying in a conversation instead of retreating the moment they sense disinterest. And sometimes it goes badly. Someone dismisses them. Someone gets impatient. Someone confirms their worst fear that needing things makes them a burden. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes someone responds with kindness, with patience, with the kind of presence they've been craving their entire life. And in that moment, they realize something profound. Maybe the problem wasn't that I was too much. Maybe the problem was that I was asking the wrong people, or asking in a way that expected rejection, or not asking at all because I'd already decided the answer was no. This is the moment of recognition. The moment where the invisible becomes visible, where the pattern that has shaped their entire life suddenly has a name, a history, a reason. And with that recognition comes a choice. They can continue living the way they always have, hidden, careful, undemanding. They can keep pretending that invisibility is safe, that not needing anyone is freedom. Or they can begin the slow, painful, necessary work of learning to be seen, of unlearning the belief that their needs are burdens, of teaching themselves, one small moment at a time, that they are allowed to take up space, that their presence is not an imposition, that being a fully, messily, vulnerable human is not something they have to apologize for. The war inside them doesn't end here, but it changes, because now they understand what they're fighting, not other people, not the world, themselves. The version of themselves that learned, long ago, that being invisible was the safest way to survive. And now they're beginning to wonder, what if I don't want to just survive anymore? What if I want to be seen? Healing, it turns out, is not about becoming someone new. It's about unbecoming everything you had to be in order to survive. For the ignored child, this means unlearning invisibility. And that is harder than it sounds. Because invisibility was never just a habit. It was a strategy, a form of protection, a way of moving through the world that kept them safe from the pain of being overlooked again. To let go of it feels like stepping into open air with no guarantee that anyone will catch you. But they begin anyway. Not because they're suddenly brave, not because they've resolved all their fears, but because staying invisible has become more painful than the risk of being seen. The first step is often the smallest one, noticing. Noticing when they're about to apologize for something that doesn't require an apology. Noticing when they're minimizing their feelings before anyone else has the chance to. Noticing when they're shrinking themselves to fit into a space that should be big enough for them as they are. Just noticing, not changing yet, just seeing the pattern as it happens. And once they start noticing, they can't stop. They see it everywhere. In the way they frame requests as questions, giving others an easy out. Would it be okay if, instead of what I need? In the way they preface their thoughts with, this might be stupid, but, as if bracing for dismissal. On the way they offer to leave before anyone asks them to. Noticing it is uncomfortable, because it reveals just how much energy they've been spending on making themselves smaller, how exhausting it's been to constantly monitor themselves, to always be the one who adjusts, who accommodates, who disappears. But noticing is not enough. Awareness alone doesn't change the pattern. What comes next is harder, choosing differently. They start small. In a conversation, they resist the urge to immediately deflect when someone asks how they are. Instead of the automatic "I'm fine," they pause. They consider. They say, cautiously, "Actually, I've been struggling a bit." And they wait. Wait to see if the sky falls. Wait to see if the person pulls away. Wait to see if their fear was right, that honesty is too much, that vulnerability drives people away. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the person changes the subject. Sometimes they offer shallow reassurance and move on. And in those moments, the old wound opens again. The old belief resurfaces. See, I was right. I shouldn't have said anything. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes the person leans in. They ask more. They stay. They meet the vulnerability with presence instead of discomfort. And in those moments, something shifts. A tiny crack in the armor. A small piece of evidence that maybe, just maybe, being seen doesn't always end in abandonment. They learn to ask for things. No demands, not ultimatums, just honest requests. Could you help me with this? I'd really like to spend time with you. I need to talk about something that's been bothering me. Each request feels like stepping onto thin ice. Each one carries the weight of a lifetime of believing that asking is dangerous. But they ask anyway. And they learn something crucial. Most people don't see requests as burdens. Most people are willing to show up, to help, to be present if they know what's needed. The problem was never that the ignored child needed too much. The problem was that they never let anyone know they needed anything at all. They begin to practice staying. Staying in conversations even when they feel the urge to retreat. Staying in relationships even when vulnerability makes them want to run. Staying present with their own emotions instead of immediately pushing them down or pushing them away. This is perhaps the hardest part. Because staying means feeling. And feeling means confronting all the loneliness, all the hurt, all the years of believing they didn't matter. It means sitting with the grief of the child who was never seen, the anger at the adults who should have noticed, the sadness of all the connections they've kept at arm's length because they were too afraid to let anyone close. It's not a linear process. There are days when they slide back into old patterns, days when they apologize too much, minimize too much, disappear too much, days when the fear is louder than the desire to be seen. But slowly, incrementally, something changes. They start to notice that the people who truly care about them don't want them to be low maintenance. They want them to be real. They want the whole person, not just the carefully curated version who never asks for anything. They start to recognize the difference between people who are emotionally available and people who aren't. They learn that some relationships were built on their invisibility, on them being the one who always gives, never receives. and those relationships might not survive this shift. Not because they're doing anything wrong, but because they're no longer willing to play a role that requires them to stay small. And that's okay. Painful, but okay. Because they're learning that being seen by the right people is more important than being tolerated by everyone. They discover that boundaries are not walls. That saying no doesn't make them selfish. That taking up space doesn't make them a burden. That having needs is not a flaw. It's part of being human. They learn to catch themselves when they start to disappear. When they feel that familiar pull to make themselves smaller, easier, less complicated, and instead of automatically following that pull, they pause. They ask, what do I actually need right now? What would it look like to stay visible in this moment? Sometimes the answer is still to step back, not out of fear, but out of genuine self-care. Because learning to be seen doesn't mean forcing yourself to be vulnerable with everyone, all the time. It means choosing when and with whom to show up fully. It means discernment, not defensiveness. They start to rewrite the story they've been telling themselves. The story that says their worth is conditional. That love is something they have to earn by being undemanding. That their presence is only acceptable when it's convenient for others. The new story is quieter, less certain, but it goes something like this. I am allowed to need people. I am allowed to ask for help. I am allowed to take up space without apologizing for it. My needs are not burdens, they are bridges to connection. My feelings are not inconveniences, they are invitations to intimacy. I don't have to earn the right to be seen. I was always worth seeing. I just never learned to believe it. It's not a dramatic transformation. There's no single moment where they suddenly feel healed, complete, whole. Instead, it's 1,000 small moments, 1,000 tiny choices to stay instead of disappear, 1,000 quiet acts of courage where they let themselves be known. And gradually, being seen starts to feel less terrifying. Not easy, but it is possible. Not natural yet, but learnable. They realize that they've been carrying the ignored child with them all along. And that child doesn't need to be fixed or erased. That child needs to be seen, acknowledged, told that what happened wasn't their fault, that they weren't unworthy of attention, they just didn't receive it. And now, as an adult, they can give that child what no one else did. They can see themselves. They can notice their own needs. They can offer themselves the presence, the attunement, the gentle acknowledgement that they've been searching for in others. This is what learning to be seen looks like, not a sudden unveiling, but a slow, deliberate practice of showing up, of staying, of allowing themselves to exist fully in spaces that once felt too risky. It's not about becoming loud or demanding. It's about becoming honest, present, real. It's about finally believing that they deserve to be in the room, not hovering at the edges, not waiting for permission, but standing in the center of their own life. Visible, imperfect, undeniably there. There is something the ignored child carries that others do not. Something that was forged in the silence, in the years of watching from the margins, in the quiet mastery of reading rooms and people, and all the things left unsaid. It is a gift they never asked for. A gift born from pain, but a gift nonetheless. They see the invisible. They notice the person standing at the edge of the gathering, the one whose voice keeps getting talked over, the one who smiles but whose eyes betray something else. They recognize the subtle withdrawal, the careful self-editing, the way someone makes themselves smaller to fit into a conversation that doesn't quite have room for them, because they know what that feels like. They know what it is to be present but unseen, to speak into a silence that doesn't register your words, to exist in a space where your absence wouldn't be noticed. And so they notice, they see, they reach out to the overlooked ones, not with pity, but with recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that says, I see you, you're not invisible to me. This is the paradox of their experience. The very thing that wounded them being ignored has given them an extraordinary capacity for presence, for attunement, for noticing the people and moments that others miss. They have become the person they needed as a child. Not perfectly, not without their own struggles and limitations, but they carry a sensitivity, an awareness, a depth of emotional perception that comes only from having lived in the shadows, from having felt what it's like to be the afterthought, the background, the one whose needs were never quite urgent enough. And now, when they show up for others, they do so with a particular kind of care. They remember to follow up. They notice when someone's energy shifts. They ask the second question, the one that goes beneath the surface of, I'm fine. They create space for people to be real, to be struggling, to be something other than okay, because they know what it costs to always have to be okay, to always have to manage yourself so that no one else has to think about you. This doesn't erase their pain. It doesn't make the years of being overlooked suddenly worth it. Suffering is not inherently redemptive. Wounds do not become virtues simply because something beautiful grew around them. But it does mean something. It means that the story of the ignored child is not only about loss, it's also about what they found in that loss. A kind of vision, a kind of knowing, a fierce, quiet determination to make sure that no one in their presence feels the way they once felt. They become safe people, the ones others gravitate toward when they need to be heard, the ones who don't interrupt, don't dismiss, don't rush past vulnerability in search of easy answers, the ones who can sit with discomfort, with silence, with the messy, unresolved parts of being human, because they've lived there. They know that territory, and they know that what people need most in those moments is not advice or solutions. They need presence. They need someone to bear witness to their pain without trying to fix it or minimize it or talk them out of it. The ignored child, now grown, has become an expert in this, in the art of being with someone, in the practice of making people feel less alone. And there's a beauty in that, a strange, bittersweet beauty. But here's the more important part. They're learning to offer that same presence to themselves. For so long, they ignored themselves the way others once ignored them. They dismissed their own needs, minimized their own feelings, treated their own inner world as something inconvenient, something to be managed, rather than honored. But now, slowly, they're learning to turn that gift inward, to notice when they're struggling, to acknowledge when they need something, to see themselves with the same compassion, the same attentiveness, the same gentle curiosity they've always offered others. They're learning that being seen begins with seeing yourself, that the person you've been waiting for, the one who will finally notice, finally understand, finally acknowledge your worth, can be you. Not in a self-sufficient, I don't need anyone way, but in a self-aware, self-compassionate way. In a way that says, I see what I've been through, I understand why I became who I became, and I can hold space for all of it, the pain, the patterns, the parts of me that are still healing. This is the gift of awareness. Not the awareness of being ignored, but the awareness that comes after. The recognition of the pattern, the understanding of where it came from, the compassion for the child who adapted the only way they knew how, and the wisdom to know that adaptation doesn't have to be a life sentence. They look back now and see their younger self with different eyes. Not as the child who wasn't enough to be noticed, but as the child who learned to survive in an environment that couldn't see them, who developed extraordinary skills in reading people, in managing emotions, in creating safety through invisibility. That child was brilliant, resilient, resourceful. That child did what they had to do. And now, the adult can honor that, can thank that child for keeping them safe, for getting them through, for building the armor that protected them when no one else would. But they can also tell that child, you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to stay hidden. You don't have to stay small. I've got you now. I see you now. And I'm not going to overlook you the way others did. This is not the end of the story. There is no perfect ending to a story like this. The patterns don't disappear overnight. The wounds don't fully close. There will be days when the old fear resurfaces, when the instinct to disappear feels overwhelming, when being seen still feels more dangerous than being invisible. But there will also be moments, more and more of them, when they stay, when they speak, when they let themselves be known, when they take up space without apologizing, when they believe, even if just for a moment, that they are worth the attention they're receiving. And in those moments, something shifts, not just in them, but in the people around them. Because when someone who has spent their life being invisible finally allows themselves to be seen, it gives others permission to do the same. Their courage becomes contagious. Their honesty invites others to be honest. Their willingness to show up fully creates a space where others feel safe to do the same. And maybe that's the real gift. Not just that they can see the invisible, but by becoming visible themselves, they make it easier for others to emerge from the shadows. The ignored child, once lost in the margins, becomes a kind of lighthouse, a steady presence that says, you can exist here, fully, imperfectly. You don't have to earn your place. You don't have to be easy or convenient or low maintenance. You can be real, and that will be enough. This is what the journey looks like. Not a straight line from pain to healing, but a spiral, a slow circling back to the self, with more awareness each time, more compassion, more willingness to be seen. And eventually, something remarkable happens. They realize that they're no longer waiting for someone else to see them. They're no longer scanning rooms for signs of interest or disinterest. They're no longer monitoring themselves to make sure they're not too much. They're just present, in their own life, in their own skin, in the fullness of who they are. Not invisible, not hiding, not apologizing for existing, just there, visible, real, whole. And that quiet presence, that simple, profound act of showing up as themselves, is perhaps the greatest act of courage they'll ever commit. Because the world tried to teach them they didn't matter. And they chose, slowly and imperfectly, to believe something else. They chose to see themselves, to honor themselves, to take up space in a world that once made them feel like they had none. And in doing so, they became the person they always needed. The one who notices, the one who stays, the one who sees. Not just others, but themselves. Finally, fully, themselves.